So I think we are ready to go. It looks like everyone is in here. Awesome to see everybody. I am Carrie Klutz, Head of Country Programs at Open Contracting Partnership. Welcome to the, we'll call it the official launch of this research report. Really happy to see that there's so much interest in this, and we're really excited to share the findings with you all today, and really looking forward especially to your feedback. I just shared the Living Notes document, and we'll share that a couple times throughout the presentation as people continue to join, and sort of remind you that it's there for any questions that come up as we go. So in terms of background, this project grew out of our annual field survey last year, as well as conversations with our partners in countries across the world, where we identified a need to improve the support that's available for people working on open contracting in what we had loosely called low-tech contexts, and especially looking at resources and support around advocacy, analysis, and monitoring. That was our assumption going into this. So we've been working for the past several months with the Austin team and agency to test those assumptions and to help provide recommendations on where we need to focus to improve the offerings that are available. Unfortunately, needless to say, the COVID pandemic sort of overlapped almost exactly with the time frame of this project, and threw a bit of a wrench into the initial plans, including having to strap in-country interviews on the ground with partners. But we've worked to adapt, and I think we've got a really solid report and some really interesting findings to share with you all. So very excited about that. And so we at OCP are thinking about these recommendations and how they'll feed into our work moving forward, but wanted to flag that we're especially keen to collaborate with others, especially those of you on this call, as we think about these and sort of roll out the next steps. So please do let us know if you're interested in continuing that conversation with us. That's sort of my plea to you all. So we'll have the report itself, as well as the mapping, which the agency team will walk us through. We'll have that available for feedback over the next month or so, and very much looking forward to continuing the discussion. So with that, I will hand over to the agency team to walk us through what they have found.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Carrie. We are the agency team, Nonso and I. I'm Anka, for those of you who don't know me. I know a lot of you on the call, but not everyone. Thank you to OCP for being interested in this work. I think it's really very important to be critically thinking about the support that anyone is putting out there, be it for open contracting or be it for anything else. So I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys. And thank you to a lot of people on this call who we interviewed, whose support we mapped, and of course to the agency team. So today, we're going to talk at you for a little bit. And we're going to present the almost 70-page research report in a few slides. So we're going to present the research. Basically, it's going to be an overview of what we did, our approach that we took, given the limitations. Some thoughts around, as Carrie was saying, low-tech contexts and other considerations. The support itself, so we're going to dive deep into the 82 support offerings that we've mapped. And then we're going to take a look at the gaps or what the mapping can tell us about the gaps in the support that exist. We're going to do a quick break for questions. So slide 31 or in the notes doc, however you guys prefer, if you guys can actively be writing us questions throughout the presentation, that's going to be very useful for us to then be able to answer some of your burning questions. We're going to take a quick look at the recommendations, a roadmap of recommendations. And if we have time, we're going to do an exercise with you all on the call to validate your support in the support mapping. If not, it's going to be some fun homework for you all. And then we're going to talk about next steps. So that's the agenda. And just to say, Nonso and I designed this presentation and also this report, but specifically this presentation for you all, meaning the facilitator, the support creator, the support giver, right? Nonso and I have also been on facilitating and supporting for quite a while. So this is something that we hold near and dear. But essentially what we want you guys to think of when listening is, what does your support look like as an organization, right? What does EVOS's support look like? What does Development Gateway support look like? What does Global Integrity support look like? And how do these concepts that we're going to be presenting here today, how do they apply to you? And how might you then be able to improve that support based on your guys' objectives? All right. I'll hand it over to Nonso.
Yeah, thanks, Anka. Hi, everyone. My name is Nonso. So very quickly, I'm just gonna talk you through what the approach for this research was. It was pretty straightforward. I guess everyone still remembers that COVID is still around, right? And so that greatly impacted what the original design and intentions were. But basically, like Kerry was saying, and as Anka had said, there were questions around what is the support that is available to practitioners in low-tech contexts, right? But also it was the realization or the hypothesis that there has been a lot of support put out there. Why is there persistence, request for additional support? What's happening in there, right? And so the body of this research was really trying to zoom into that and answer those kinds of questions. There are two specific things that we did. That was speaking to you all on this call, the facilitators. And by facilitators, we mean people who don't work directly on opening up contracting or in-country activities, right? But then you provide support to practitioners who work in-country. And so we were opportune to interview you guys. And obviously working remotely made that very feasible. And then we also did a mapping of existing support, right? And so first thinking of the people we had spoken to, but then like snowballing into additional support offerings that were out there. A lot of the supports that we did map, or actually all of it, were limited to online searches. I mean, if you're looking at the table right now, you would see what we tried to do there. We made considerations for basically how are these things described, where are they found, what link leads you there, what does it try to do, accomplish for you, what use cases does it address, and stuff like that. But we would go in depth into it in a short while. So this is a quick list of organizations from where we had spoken to people. And so no need to read through it, but we just want to say thank you once again for availing your time and your expertise and experience to us. Anka?
Yeah, and then like I mentioned, we mapped the 82 support offerings. If you guys want, you can jump into the spreadsheet. Just don't get too distracted yet because there's a lot in there. But yeah, so we mapped 82 support offerings. It's not exhaustive. It is a very good list, especially when thinking of international facilitators. But unfortunately, what we didn't get to do was dive deeply into regional or local facilitators, just a few like PPDC, for example, or Poder or Social Tech. All right, so what is low tech? This is a question that we asked many of you. And it was an interesting discussion. I think originally what OCP and we were thinking was, low tech users, what might that look like in low tech contexts? And we were trying to kind of define it. But what we actually moved away from saying that it has, a definition per se, but what are some things that you should consider when thinking of supporting a person, an organization, or a context, a low tech context, right? So a few things here that I want to highlight. Originally, we were focusing in on the user's capacity level, and a little bit what we realized with the interviews with you is that there's a difference. There's almost a conflation in between their capacity level and the knowledge, the basic knowledge level, the understanding conceptually of what open contracting is, versus are they able to do the things that they need to be able to do, or their capacity level, right? So when thinking about users, it's knowledge level, it's capacity level. And then we added another one that is very important as we looked at the mapping and as we heard from you all, which is the community maturity level. And as Carrie notes, when we say community, we don't mean international, global community who, we're all on this call together, but we mean people working in open contracting in their contexts, right? In their city, in their country, whatever that looks like. So how mature is that community, right? And all of these considerations are then going to see how strong that user is within that context and what type of support that user needs, right? And in terms of the context, what we came into was a lot of how technically sound is this context, right? Technical infrastructure, data availability, data quality. But then of course what was added and what really came through in the interviews is there's of course a lot of other factors, right? As there is in all contexts, but specifically when you think about potentially low tech context, it's also the political, it's the legal, it's obviously the social, and then cultural and behavioral.
Thank you, Anka. And so we came up with 10 findings. At some point we were trying to make sure it was precisely 10. That's just a joke anyways. So we came up with 10 findings and they sort of address three separate things. So there's a set of those findings that are specific to the support offerings that are out there. The set of the findings that speaks to the gap around the support. And then there is a set of findings that sort of addresses what we could synthesize from our interactions with the facilitators. There's a lot more in the body of the report around the thoughts of the facilitators that you might want to dig into. That is quite interesting. But so around the low-tech support offerings that are out there, that are available, right? Just building off of what Anka was saying, we did realize that there was really a need to constantly think about this like nuanced considerations for what low-tech is whenever you're designing or implementing support in low-tech context, low-tech. Then the second thing is that support offerings vary in intensity, right? But what that also meant wasn't just about like intensity. It's like it actually paints a picture of how much investment has been put into that support. And invariably, or arguably, you could say like to what extent that support could make a difference, right? So the concept of intensity, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Then we also found that support offerings actually have diverse goals that they aim to achieve, right? So there are different support offerings, they aim to achieve diverse goals. And when you think about the different goals, you find that depending on the context and the situation in that context, the goals might apply differently, right? And you can also match up the goals to the intensity level. So it's gradually building on each other. And then finally, within the support offerings that are available was a question answered around what use cases do they ultimately achieve, right? And so there were a few use cases that we zoomed into. We started out the research thinking of advocacy, monitoring, and analysis, but we also then factored in use cases that were related to engagements and also use cases that are related to case building. When it comes to the gaps in support, there were quite a few that we found, but again, it still went back to thinking again about the considerations for low tech, right? Seeing that supports that were out there often just thought or considered a few of the considerations, but not exhaustively all the considerations. So that's kind of one area of gap. The other area of gap was also that we found that the high and medium intensity support, which we will talk a bit more about, were low in quantity compared to the low intensity support. So there is low intensity, medium intensity, and high intensity support. The low intensity support is in excess compared to the high and the medium intensity support. Then if we look closely again at the goals, right, we found that the number of support offerings that actually address the high intensity kind of goals, which is around capacity building, co-creation, and accompaniment, were also few in number. And finally, we found that like advocacy as a use case didn't get quite a significant amount of support compared to other use cases that we examined. Just a quick one on what we found with facilitators is that facilitators generally lean into the idea of doing more co-creation, but the case is that doesn't quite always happen. And not just co-creation, like a sort of a user-centered approach that involves the practitioners. When creating support, everybody thinks and wants to act in that way, but that doesn't often happen in practice. Then there was the fine piece around training for people for practitioners, basically, right? So training happens, but oftentimes it's like training is a go-to approach to supporting practitioners in low-tech context, but it always doesn't get to all the needs that are found within the low-tech context. So it's like the one thing that we always use, but it doesn't quite address the range of needs that exist in the context. Thank you. All right. So we would switch over to the existing support, kind of taking you into the material now, but not too deep because you get to read the report. So one of the first concepts that we kind of put out there around the existing support is the nature of people who are creating support and what triggers the creation of support. So quite obviously, there are international facilitators who are creating support, and then there are also actors at the regional level who are creating support. This research was able to get in total 82 support offerings. 69 of those were by international facilitators, and then the other 13 were from regional facilitators. There is a bit more disaggregation in there, but we're not going to get into that now. And then when we talked about what triggers the creation of support, this is really coming off of our synthesis and a few of the interviews that we had conducted, that often facilitators start to create support off of the missions of the organizations or the priorities of the organization. So every support out there is like scoped to what an organization prioritizes, right? And so if there is an organization that embeds itself in advocacy, you will find that it would naturally start out creating supports that are useful for advocacy, right? And so it's often coming from that place. But as time goes on, as progress happens, people then begin to create support based off of new evidence or new solutions, right? And so we've created a support X, and it's not yet reaching a kind of need that we want, or we gather new insights that there is, additional support that could be used in areas like this. And then that leads to the creation of a new kind of support, right? So there is that progression. And then finally, there is when we start to feel like this support is becoming useful, there's a tendency to want to then scale that support or to replicate it. And so sometimes you find that people will say a support offering that is useful in the Philippines, someone in Uganda, for instance, may encounter it and want to replicate it because the person finds it useful. And so that's sort of the progression or the triggers for creation of support.
And now we're going to get into the meat, the support itself. So we gave you the answers a few slides back. We gave you the findings, but now we're going to look at what the support is. What are we talking about? So these are the 5 kind of big categories of support types, right? There are processes. Of the 82, 38 are processes, right? There are tools, there are services, methodologies, and initiatives. We'll get a lot more in depth, and you'll see these 5 types coming up. But what we can say is across the board, almost every single support creator has a process, right? A process here is some sort of overview, generally written. It can be a guide. There are many like different types of processes, right? But it's, you know, something that is light that you can hand to the practitioner and say, you know, you take this on yourself, right? Then there's tools which are, you know, of higher and lower complexity. Services are something that the facilitator, you guys, are offering to the practitioner, paid or unpaid, but it is a service. Methodologies, right? So also just a note, for OCP, for example, their interest in looking at low-tech support, a lot of their support is around methodologies like OCDS, but that's not included here because it's not necessarily something that we would consider low-tech, but it's other types of methodologies that would support a practitioner in their low-tech open contracting work, right? And then finally, initiatives. And you guys can see a little sneak peek of the examples of support here. So to take it one step a little bit more complex, Nanso mentioned intensity levels. There's 3 intensity levels. There's low intensity. So like I was mentioning with the processes, those are low intensity supports, self-service, typically one-off. And low intensities are not only processes, but we're also considering some methodologies and tools as low intensity support. It's something that, again, the facilitator just is handing off and the practitioner is hopefully using, right? Then we go one level up, medium intensity. These are, again, not surprising, services or tools. This is a little bit more involvement from the facilitator, right? It's not as high intensity as high intensity, but it is a little bit more involved. So this, for example, is maybe a help desk as a service, right? That many of you guys are familiar with, but that kind of service. And then finally, high intensity is, you know, the facilitator is all in. This is, for example, EVOS's Open Up contracting program, or Loki, or obviously OCP's Lift. It's very hands-on. It's demand-driven. This is, you know, user-driven in the sense that the facilitator is working very closely with the practitioner. So as you can see, it's the great majority, almost 75%, is low intensity of the 82 support mappings that we found. Then a little bit more medium intensity, and finally the least amount, high intensity, which, you know, is that makes sense. So here, you guys get a little sneak peek of the support mapping. This is what it looks like if you're not already in it. And here are a few examples of some high intensity. So what I already mentioned, so there's OCP's Lift, which is an initiative that's high intensity. As you can see, all of the initiatives that we've mapped, all of them are high intensity, comes to no surprise. And then the rest of the high intensity are all services. So OCP's Help Desk, Check My School, right? So we have here actually a few local and regional high intensity support offerings, which is very interesting. And if you're curious about the use cases, they are soon to come. We'll talk about them a little bit more in a few minutes. Medium intensity. So here are another few examples. Again, OCP's questions or ideas email, which is, you know, potentially something that can be used even a lot more as a service. So beyond maybe the help desk, which is OCDS focus, how can we use this email, for example, is something that OCP might be thinking about. How can we use this email as a service to cater to, you know, all types of practitioners? Then we have both of Development Gateway's tools, the very well-known one, Corruption Risk Dashboard and Procurement M&E Platform. Then we have a few tools from Transparency International, the Open Contracting Hub, also from NRGI. So here you see that the medium intensity are all services or tools, right? And the tools are much more involved, right? We also have Quien es Quien Wiki from Poder, again, another example of a regional, one of the few we mapped, not exhaustive again. And then of course, PPDC's Budeshi. All right. And finally, we couldn't get them all on one slide. That's how many there are. Low intensity support types. So again, this is where you'll see all of the processes. You'll see also some tools and some methodologies here. Take a look. We don't have time to go in all of these, but there's a lot of them from a lot of you, from Transparency International, from EVOS, from OGP, OCP, the Engine Room, International Budget Partnership, and a few local and regional examples as well. So we're getting a better idea of what the support types are. Now we're going to move to goals. What are the goals of these support types?
Awesome. Thanks, Anka. And so I think to get a hang on the goals, the question is, you as a facilitator, when you create a support or when you provide a support, what are you intending to achieve by it? Or if you think back to the goals that you have been putting out in the past couple of months, years, weeks, what have you been hoping to achieve by those goals that you put out? So that's really where this is coming from, right? And so this is our synthesis, looking at the different support offerings and imagining what do they seek to accomplish. It's a long list of 12. We weren't aiming for a specific number, but it's a long list of 12. And so it started out with tutorials, right? Or a goal that is to serve as a tutorial, right? And then there were goals that were to bring together support that exists in diverse places. So like some sort of a compiler, right? And then there is the one that is out there trying to inspire, like stimulate the thinking, show you what is possible. So we kind of tag that inspiration, right? There is a goal that is for making a case, mostly around open contracting, being this, a reform that is mainstreaming or is now mainstream. There is a lot of support out there that is positioning it to helping the practitioners make a case, right? And so that's the case builder. And then there is also so much support out there that is thinking about giving guidance. And so again, hands off, but you're able to know what to do when you don't have anyone to tell you what to do, right? And lastly, there were those that were self-help. And so all of these first 6 goals are often low intensity support types that offer them. That's the thing that is unique about them. I wouldn't go into all the examples, but yeah, that's the first set of 6 goals that we have. And then we move over to another 6. I'll take the first 3. And so repositories, right? These are resource points where, we're either opening up data, opening up research. They constitute the repositories. There is also the simulations that sort of, you're not in the real life instance yet, but it's trying to give you that sense of what to do if you were in a situation like this. And then lastly, the goals of inquiry, right? So if there are questions, we are able to answer them. We put all of these 3 in medium intensity, because if you think about them, they are not support offerings that you create and you hands off, right? They are not support offerings that you create and you just hand it over to the practitioner and hope that they use it. These are support offerings that when you start to create them, there is some level of involvement that is required from you to achieve these goals. So repositories need to be updated, simulations need to be walked through, presented, coached through. Inquiries, you have to always be on the phone. Lastly, there's a last set of 3, the capacity building or builder, the co-create, and then the accompaniment. These are all high intensity goals, and they all often come from services, mostly. And then it's like, as Anka had been describing what high intensity is about, it's like hands-on, directly engaged, you are accompanying, you are getting your hands dirty in what's happening in the context.
Yep. Adding another concept. And again, these all build off of each other, right? So we're now thinking of use cases. As Carrie mentioned, they were initially from OCP thinking of 3 use cases. These might not be all the use cases for everyone, but from what we've seen for the support mapping, the main ones are these 5, right? So it is the 3 that OCP started off thinking critically about, which is monitoring, analysis, and advocacy. Those were their 3, right? It was a very interesting journey to get to these 5. We went through the support mapping many times. I'm almost embarrassed to say how many, to try to really grapple with what is like this support actually trying to accomplish, and like really getting deep into that support. What we realized even before looking at, you know, how many of each use cases there are, is that there's 2 other use cases that we see cutting across most of these 82 support offerings, which is also engagement. So trying to either coach the practitioners, right, and engage in their work, or engage a group of practitioners together. And then the other very interesting one is case building. So what we saw here is that there was a bit, again, of a conflation between building the case for open contracting, right? You know, again, building maybe that, that knowledge level around open contracting, around what it is, why is it important, why should we as a government or a civil society organization be interested in it? So building the case versus actually being able to use open contracting for your advocacy, whatever that might be, if that is in, you know, anti-corruption, if that's in a specific sector, right? Health or education, whatever that might be. So we split those 2. And there's something very interesting happened where before we were seeing, oh my God, there's so much, you know, there's so many use cases for advocacy. What we're actually seeing is there's a lot of use cases for building up the case for open contracting, which is something that of course is very logical, right? Open contracting is relatively, it's a nascent field. And so of course, during the first few years, what you're really trying to do is building the case. But now what we're seeing is, you know, people are slowly moving, and we would encourage even a faster move to more advocacy, monitoring and analysis, and other use cases as well. So these are the use cases that we've documented. It's a pretty even split. And that might not say a lot to you. Also, you know, be thinking of what is the use case that I, as an organization, want, and what do my users, what do my practitioners that I work with need? So a little bit more on this. In our analysis, we saw something very interesting where there's a, you know, in our own perceptions of what is a very useful support offering, the most useful ones either had all 5 use cases tagged or 1 or 2, right? So here are a few examples, actually all of the examples, with all 5 use cases. And as you can see, all of the initiatives are there. Then there's a few processes, which is very interesting. One process, which I know Carrie would argue maybe is not low intensity because it took so much work from so many people, the open contracting playbook. There's another process, the open contracting practitioners guide. Like these are very, you know, thorough, let's say, resources with just a lot of information, and very well created and curated. Just a note that Nonso and I were very excited to hear the story behind the Open Contracting Practitioners Guide, particularly, right? How it was co-created among so many practitioners. So of course it is hitting on all of the use cases that are very useful to practitioners. All right, so then, and again, you see high intensity is the majority, but there are these interesting low intensity ones. There are many more with either 1 or 2 use cases, and why these are, you know, particularly interesting. There's a whole section on this, so please do read it in the report. But why this is particularly interesting is because, and particularly well thought out, is because it's so targeted. This support only aims to do, for example, case building, right? OCP has a lot of case building support. That is excellent because this is what they're wanting to do with it. And I'm sure, and again, we didn't talk to practitioners, but I'm sure that these are, you know, the tools that practitioners are actually using if they're low intensity and directly applying, right? Then there's others from, for example, the engine room in collaboration with OCP, where it's focusing on one thing, tool reuse, right? There's another example from IBP, from NRGI, right? NRGI, Open Oil, and Columbia's and OCP's resource contracts does one thing. It's focusing on this specific thing. So something to, I think, keep in mind when looking critically at your support, is it well targeted enough, or is it, you know, thorough enough, right? And of course, this analysis is based on, you know, the concepts that we've pulled out, that the common threads that we've seen. But of course, what you really want is to make sure that the practitioners actually need what it is that you're creating. And so we'll head to the gaps on that note.
Okay, thanks, Anka. So on the gaps, it's a good place to rehash that we hadn't spoken to practitioners in this process. And so a lot of what we have used to indicate, or like our analysis of gaps, is based off of numbers. It's largely quantitative in nature, right? And then also drawing some inference from the interviews that we had with the facilitators. And so, yeah, so while there is a lot of support offerings out there, the question has always then been, are we able to answer to, do practitioners actually, you know, really use the support? We don't know that. And if they do or don't, why don't they use it, right? And then there's also, if they don't use it, what exactly do they then need, right? So this sort of the gap analysis that Anka is going to walk you through doesn't quite get into those specifics, but it gives you based off of the numbers, right? If you run the numbers based on intensity, use case, goals, you know, you will see that these are the areas where things are missing, and it might be good to fill in those places.
Yeah, and so the gaps that we will take you through, while they don't necessarily reflect practitioners' needs and actual uses, what it does look at critically is the 82 support offerings, right? The gaps in one slide. So basically what we're seeing is there is a gap in support to help practitioners build their capacity related to open contracting, not necessarily their knowledge. Remember that low tech consideration difference, and increase the maturity of their local communities, right? In a way that takes their local context, and again, all of the context here, into consideration: political, legal, cultural, and technical, right? So it's a gap. Basically what we're seeing is what has been thoroughly addressed is the building of the knowledge. But where that gap is then is the building of their capacity and the building of the maturity of their local communities, right? This gap exists because of what we see in the support mapping. This gap exists because there's a lack of medium and high intensity support, especially around services and initiatives, more hands-on, more user-focused, more user-driven. The many low-intensity processes and methodologies do not always reach the practitioner's goals of being able to inquire, to build capacity, to participate, and to be accompanied. Again, big asterisks. These are practitioners' goals that we are assuming, right? We have not talked to them necessarily. We do know who they are, right? We're in this space, we can assume. But again, it would be very good for all of you to speak to your practitioners in regards to what are your goals, right? All right, so zooming in. And again, whole section in the report where you guys can dig into this a lot more. But one of the gaps is a lack of high intensity services and initiatives. This is kind of especially something to highlight now because a few of the initiatives are actually closing down. very soon, right? EVO's Open Up Contracting Program is wrapping up, at least with the partners, in its current state, as is TI's. So there's going to be even fewer initiatives for practitioners. Yeah, so I'll kind of leave this with you, but as you can see, it's again, and we're assuming kind of what the practitioners would need and want, but just even taking a look at this slide, you see, high intensity, it's initiatives, it's hands-on, it's user driven, and it's addressing all of these use cases. So you can see why it would be very important to continue exploring services and initiatives. And again, it can be something that's done in not the OCP lift, like most high intensity way, but maybe a happy medium, which brings us to few medium intensity services and tools. So one of the things that's in this report, and it's a little tease, so you guys read it, it's long, but it's hopefully helpful, is we have in this gaps section follow-up questions that you guys might want to ask your practitioners, right? So as I'm going through the gaps, I'm constantly reminding you, but we don't know, but we don't know. The knowing is asking the right questions. So in the fact that there is a gap around few medium intensity services and tools, some follow-up questions to your practitioners might be, which of these services and tools are useful to you and why? Like, what about this is useful to you? Again, that might be very different depending on your practitioners, right? But it's like digging in deeper as to what about this is useful. Is it the hands-on aspect? Is it the fact that I can ask you any questions kind of anytime? Is it the fact that I have direct, like, human contact with you, even if it is Zoom based? What is that, and are we correctly assuming that these goals are the goals that you're wanting to accomplish, right? All right, and then as we already said, so another gap is, the least amount of, Can you
get me my laptop?
Oh, it's bien. I think I recognize your voice.
Sorry.
All right, it's okay. I'm happy you're on the call. So the least amount is for advocacy. It's interesting, play around with the support mapping in itself. You'll get a lot of insights. But for example, in zooming into advocacy, 88% of high intensity support had advocacy integrated, right? Meaning, the services and initiatives especially are, catering and supporting the practitioners in accomplishing their specific advocacy goal. It's very hard to create a process to do that, right? 53% of medium intensity support has advocacy, and only 35% of light intensity support. Again, processes, some tools, some methodologies address advocacy. So that's an interesting insight there. And finally, to wrap up the gap section, we're looking specifically at low tech. So what we did is created this beautiful table, which we struggled many a day to make. But basically we're trying to put in all of these concepts into one space. So by looking at this table, you're actually seeing support goals, support intensity, right? So the white is light intensity support, the gray is medium intensity, the dark is high intensity. And then you're seeing all of the concepts in one table, and it's crossed with the low tech considerations, right? For the user and for the context. So I'll let you guys kind of, take a look and think about what this means. But essentially, so these little markings mean tutorials 100% hit on users' knowledge, right? As do compilers. They're adding a lot of knowledge to you, but they might not necessarily directly build up the capacity, the compiler in itself, right? The inspiration might also not do that, right? So it's, you know, these are definitely hitting on it. The question marks are some do, some don't, it depends. And then the X's generally, it's not hitting on it. So what you can see is that there, for example, is very little support that hits on the user's community maturity level, right? The one that there is the co-creation goal, right? Where you're co-creating with the users and themselves. So anyways, there's a lot of insights in the report on this. I'll kind of stop by saying the support is evidently lacking in the user's capacity and the user's community maturity, especially. And then also in addressing other contextual factors, you know, is everything else. So is political, legal, cultural, behavioral contexts, right? So there is few that is actually addressing those contextual factors well. All right. Break for questions. We just threw a lot of concepts at you. Thank you for listening patiently. And now we kind of wanted to turn it over to you guys to see if you have any questions. I don't know if we have any written down that Carrie, maybe you want to throw out at us.
Yeah, there are a couple in the notes doc, and then of course, anyone feel free to jump in if you have a burning question as well. But I'll start with the two that are in here. The first is, what was understood to be the definition of open contracting? Looking at some of the services and initiatives that are covered, it appears to go beyond OCDS, covers a range of public expenditure tracking exercises, and it would be useful to understand what is the scope intended for this work. And I think you all capture that in the report, but it might not have come out here, so.
Yeah. Yeah, so just quickly, we did go beyond the classic open contracting, defined as open contracting, like self-identified as open contracting, and extended beyond to, for example, fiscal transparency. We have gift in there, you know, budget, IBP. We did move a little bit beyond, but we stayed within the realm of expenditure, of budget, of, you know, the fiscal arena. We did that to also see and be inspired by and informed by other support that might be targeting very similar practitioners, right? So that's why we expanded that a bit. Nanzo, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Awesome. And yeah, not sure if that answered the question either. But feel free to follow up, whoever wrote that, if you have further questions. And again, this comes out a bit in the report as well. So once you dig into that, that may answer it too. The second question was about, you were mentioning trainings. You noted that facilitators often find trainings are not contextualized and lack a long-term approach. No doubt the recommendations of peer-to-peer learning exchanges and pooling resources for higher level support is crucial, but would like to hear your opinion on training of trainers trainings. Do you think this could tackle the issue linked with the lack of a long-term approach? And I can pop that in the chat so you can read it as well.
Yeah, I could respond to that. So I think with training, right? The concept of training of the trainers, it happens invariably, right? Whether you are intentional about it or not, people who get trained are often one way or the other passing on that training to other people within the context. So that happens, right? But I think the issue is it's not happening at a fast enough pace that it can help consolidate this community maturity that we speak of, right? And so think about the first set of user-related considerations as a linear path, where it's like you go from knowledge to gaining capacity to them becoming this like community of practitioners who, you know, support each other, reinforce one another, pursue the same goals, do joint advocacy or whatever that the case may be, right? It gets lost in the training because the pace at which the training can actually lead to a mature community isn't happening fast enough for the kinds of goals that, if there were to be a community in place, could easily achieve that. So it's like there has to be some other intentional approach to developing the community itself, besides thinking that the training, like, you know, because I train and then the trainers train other people, it's also the thing that people who get trained also might leave and no longer be in this, like, you know, this beautiful linear diagram that I'm making. Yeah.
I'll just draw a diagram. Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add there is the trainings that many of you guys spoke to us about are focused on the technical, right? And not necessarily either contextualize or go beyond that and look at what is it that the user or the practitioner is trying to accomplish. It's just, let me train you on this technical thing. So if you do contextualize it more, that might be very different. That might be a good method to actually, you know, get across the training. But again, it very much depends on what your practitioners need. Your practitioners might not need a training. I know that there's some practitioners / facilitators on that call. They don't need a training necessarily. What they might need is some support that is, like, you know, longer term and helping them grapple with the design of something, the design of their advocacy, the design of their monitoring, but it's not necessarily a training, if that makes sense.
Great. Thank you. Next questions. I will give you two because they're both directly related to the mapping. So first, are any insights regarding quality of support rather than quantity? And then second, are there examples of map support tools, initiatives, and are the use cases actually documented? How the support resulted in tangible impact?
Are there examples of? I didn't catch that.
It says, do we have examples of concrete examples of map support tools / initiatives? For example, how the support resulted in tangible impact. Are these use cases actually documented?
Yeah. Nancy, you want to start?
Yeah, I could go there. So the thing I see around that question is, not having spoken to practitioners, we can't give this sort of concrete examples, right? Because, like, the next stage of this research would be taking off a few of those, and which you would see in the recommendation, right? Taking off a few of those support offerings and user testing them with practitioners on the ground to then get that clear, concrete examples of use cases that have made an impact, right? So that wasn't achieved through this process. But also at the same time, I think that the frame quality is something that is very tricky because it could mean many things, right? But besides meaning many things, is also the fact that every support offering out there has been some level of effort and investment has been put towards it, right? And I think what is more critical is when we try to use a support that is supposed to be for low intensity goals and expect it to achieve high intensity goals. That's kind of where the system breaks down, right? So yes, we didn't look at quality, but again, you can begin your inquiry into the quality question based on the intensity level. So think about the intensity first, right? That's a question of quality as well, but it doesn't, when it's low quality, doesn't mean it's bad quality. When it's low intensity, doesn't mean that it's bad quality. It's, let's do our accounting properly and say a low intensity support is supposed to do this much. Let's not expect it to do that much, which is like, accompany people all the way, because it's just like put out there, especially in low tech context where people would depend on that accompaniment. People would depend on that hand holding. People want that face-to-face one-on-one interaction ongoing to be able to then, like, get these things done. That's sort of where the angle I could think of that from.
Yeah.
That's the perfect response. I have nothing to add.
And then one last one, and then that was a great segue into recommendations, which are coming next. But the last question here, I'll try and read it even as it's being formed. How demand-driven are these initiatives? How involved are the practitioners in designing the solutions or building their capacity? And I think you all have some findings or thoughts around that. If they are demand-driven, what is preventing them from being used more successfully? Is it lack of funding or simply lack of interest?
Yeah, and to that last piece, we don't get sick of saying it, but we didn't talk to the practitioners, so we can't say if they're using it and why they might be using it, like what is attractive to them in that, or why they're not using it and what is missing. So we can't answer that piece of the question. Are the initiatives and services like co-created is essentially what they're asking. That's an interesting question. I don't think that we can, I mean, we can make assumptions around that. And I think that generally when, you know, I know the initiatives by heart at this point, but generally when an organization gets to the level of we're going to create an initiative, it's because they have a lot of experience in either support or in the topic or both, right? So it might not be co-created in the co-creation process, right? Let's all sit down, let's all do this together, but it is informed by a lot of experience, by a lot of work with practitioners. I would assume that that's the case, and Carrie can speak more on this, for OCP Lift. That wasn't created, you know, immediately, but kind of down the line. I would assume that's the case also for EVOS and for Transparency International's initiatives. Yeah, I don't know, Carrie, if you have anything to add there.
No, I think
could just make a
think that's exactly right. Oh, sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that whilst co-creation is useful and important, I also think we shouldn't like disregard or discard the value of residual knowledge, right? Like Anka was saying, facilitators have been through the ropes, had these interactions, and then they bring about this support offerings. But where the co-creation piece or like the user-centeredness comes into play is, it's often even a basic question, right? Is to what extent are we guaranteed that people will like do the uptake, right? I think that's sort of where the system also breaks down, right? Because we fairly know what people need. We fairly know the questions that are out there. But then there's like support gets created, put out, you know, and I who put it out, I'm not looking out if it's been uptaken, right? The practitioner probably doesn't know that it's been put out, right? Or they know and they looked at it once and then they forget. It's when are we doing the additional extra work, extra effort of making sure that people then actually use these things, right? And so yes, there is co-creation, but then also we need to think about the fact that we know some of these things. We've been around the ropes and seen these things. So yeah, we do the user research, we do the user testing, it's recommended, we want more of that, but yes, there is a mid ground there.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think that comes out and will come out in the recommendations that you're about to queue up. But Anka, you mentioned Lyft. I think that was obviously a very particular approach, but was very much informed by interviews with practitioners and a lot of really heavy thinking into what the teams needed, and then continues to be very hands-on, and sort of iterates as we go, not least because of the COVID situation and having to sort of pivot in the middle of that. But with that, I will let you all tell us what you think we should do.
Turn it over to recommendations. All right, Nunso, take it away. Oh, Nunso, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Sorry.
Okay, it's okay.
Bit of an internet glitch. Okay, yeah, show me off a bit. So basically, the recommendations, a thing to view as a roadmap. In our minds, we kind of, at least in our heads, we see the roadmap, right? It goes from recommendation 1, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and it goes to the second, 4, 5, you know, so it's a continuum that we hope that's kind of how facilitators would approach it. At the same time, there are also recommendations that you can actually like dismember from the roadmap and uptake separately. You don't have to stick to the roadmap if that's like not particularly relevant for you. They were originally written with OCP in mind, but it's clearly framed as something that any facilitator can take up, right? And so I think at this point, you can already guess what our first recommendation would be, which is we need you all to move from low intensity support, which builds knowledge, to more medium and high intensity support, which sort of gets to the capacity building and the community maturity. And just for emphasis sake, when we say move from low intensity support, it doesn't suggest or imply that the low intensity supports are not useful. It only says that there is actually a lot of it out there. And if you wanted to achieve any of those goals of like tutorials, I forget the six low intensity goals, right? There is already sufficient support offerings out there that you can, repurpose, reapply, resurface, recommunicate, I don't know, revamp, brush it up again. So moving away from the production of low intensity and thinking of how you might be able to bring about more medium and high intensity support.
So that's recommendation 1, which we there's the gap, there's the recommendation, and then there's the phases. The phases are very much put out in detail in the report. Please take a look. Then we go to recommendation 2, which is strengthening learning and collaboration among facilitators for the benefit of practitioners. We very much hope that this call is the start of that. As Carrie was mentioning, we not only want your feedback on the report or on the support mapping, but also just critical thinking around your support as well. And might we do that together as facilitators and as support creators? So one of the phase 4 of our recommendations is create peer-to-peer, facilitator to facilitator learning exchange for support, right? I know that, many of you on this call obviously, know each other very well and have exchanged a lot of ideas informally around what is working, what isn't. But is there a way that we can, get together and actually discuss a little bit more structuredly what is working and what isn't based on our own goals? Is there a way that we can collectively, use our collective brain to improve the support that we're giving to the practitioners, right? Because there's a lot of us and there's a lot of practitioners. So how might we do that better? And then another recommendation for us is, and this goes along with learning, right? It's pooling resources for more medium and high intensity support. I'm sure that as many of you are listening to this presentation, you're thinking, but we just don't have the resources for all of this high intensity support. We can't do it. So there's 2 options there, right? One is figuring out what is doable that accomplishes, the goals of a high intensity support, that is more hands-on, that is more, user-driven, that requires a little bit more contact with the practitioner, right? So there's you doing this on your own and you figuring out how, what this support might look like for you and for your organization. But another option is perhaps might we pool our resources, our time, our expertise to create a high intensity support or a medium intensity support, right? And what might that look like? I think that, we can get creative. We have ideas ourselves, but we would want to hear from you on that. So that's recommendation 2. Strengthening learning and collaboration among you all, among facilitators. And then finally, recommendation 3 should come to no surprise. Make deeper context-driven, practitioner-led investments in low-tech support. Again, of course, in recommendation 1, we have the number 1 thing that you should do is, refine the support mapping, interview the practitioners is step 2. Once you interview the practitioners, ideally, we will go from assumed needs of practitioners to known needs. Obviously, this is something that will evolve over time. This is something that, we should all be keeping track of constantly. But once you know those needs, then it's tweaking the way that you're thinking about how you're making support. And you're really wanting to base it in those practitioners' needs and contexts, right? So it's, phase 6 is investing and strengthening the local open contracting communities. There's some very interesting insights onto some very active communities in the report. Shout out to the Kenya Open Contracting Cluster. But how might we do that, either individually as an organization or as a support organization or collectively together? Support practitioners in reflecting on and diagnosing the complex challenges they face in open contracting. This is something that we didn't go into as much, but I think comes from also Nonso and mine residual knowledge, as well as from the interviews with you. But essentially what we see is that practitioners have many needs that they may not be communicating well to you, to the facilitators. That might be for a number of reasons. That might be because they think that they can't, because your programs of support are limited to this thing, or what they perceive as a limitation, right? It might not be accurate as well. But it might be because also, how civil society works. It might be because they're focused on, that one project and they're kind of myopically looking at it and they're not seeing the broader needs that they might have as an organization or as an organization that works on open contracting, right? So there's a number of reasons as to why that might happen. How can we as facilitators, bury this assumption that you can't tell us the needs more in general, and how can we really support them once we know what they are. And finally, and this is a big thing to end on, but this is where we're ending, is invest more in addressing the lack of political will in the short term and in the long term. I won't go into it too much. We write a lot about it in our recommendations, but I think suffice it to say that everyone on this call knows that political will is, a very critical cornerstone of open contracting success, or, more broadly, all of the other initiatives that we mapped, and anything fiscal, anything budget, political will is key. So how might we do this in a more creative way? And again, in a more contextualized way in the short term and in the long term. So those are our recommendations. I think, Nonso, do we have a little bit of time for the exercise?
We still have like 15 minutes. So yeah. I don't know if there's other use cases for the time, but we could.
I think it would be fun. Maybe we'll just take 5 minutes. The next 5 minutes, I'm hoping that most of you, these llamas, and most of you guys are still in there. But we wanted to do a quick validation of the support mapping with you guys on the call right now. Not to say that this is sufficient, and hopefully you guys take a look at this with your organization. But we wanted you to go into the support mapping, and of course everyone's going to go to what support they have and they own, which is great. That's the intention. And check if you feel that the way that we've mapped this is accurate. And if you have comments, please leave them. You're free to comment in the support mapping. So please do leave comments in there. So might we take maybe 5 minutes? We'll mute ourselves. And in those 5 minutes, if anyone has any last questions, to add them in the notes doc. And we'll either try to address them in the last 10 minutes of the call or on an email thread. But let's quick take that time and move over to the support mapping.
Awesome. And I would say, yes, feel free to pop any questions in, as well as if there are any reflections that come up as you're looking at the mapping, any initial sort of strikes that come to mind. I think we'd be keen to hear that too. Mm-hmm.
And just a note in the support mapping, I'm sure you guys have seen, but there's also tabs that break out by the creator, by the type, by the intensity level, and by the use cases, if you guys are curious. All right, so we're going to cut the 5 minutes a little short, but hopefully you guys started digging in and are intrigued. Yeah, I think just to wrap it up, next steps for us all, Nunso and I, Nunso, we got to reread the report that we wrote. No, read the report. We really would love to get your feedback. You guys can comment in there directly, and we're happy to answer questions or to start, thinking critically with you all. So read the report. It's long, but it's filled with lovely screenshots, so it's not that long. Then we would like you guys to validate your support offerings. So again, looking at the mapping, I mean, Nonso and I mapped this based on what we saw, but of course that might not reflect what you guys are actually trying to accomplish. You might not identify as, maybe that's not the right type, or maybe that's not the right intensity level. So please do validate, just meaning add in your comments. We'll be on the lookout for that. And then I think, thinking of the recommendations, especially recommendation 2, and hopefully this being, the trampoline for peer-to-peer and facilitator-to-facilitator learning, I would love to, encourage us all to share the learnings and that we've acquired throughout the years in regards to supporting open contracting practitioners. And I think we have a few ideas on how that might look, but we'd be curious to hear thoughts from you all, and maybe Carrie, if you have anything to add here.
Sure, just reiterating, as I said at the top of the call, so we're going to be going through this and doing some thinking internally about how to adjust what we're doing and how we're trying to support practitioners in these low-tech contexts with the new expanded definition. But I think we would be really keen to think about and collaborate with anyone on this call or anyone further that is interested in that, to figure out how we can better collaborate and cooperate and sort of build on each other. I think one of the interesting findings that you'll see in the report is that there's a lot of similar, especially lower intensity support offerings that are available. So how can we as facilitators do a better job of coordinating rather than recreating the wheel? And so really keen to sort of dig into that and pick your brains on how we can be better and more sort of useful for the people that are actually doing the work.
Awesome. Well, that's about it from us. Thank you guys all for not only listening, but really being a part of this, and for all the support that you guys bring. So thank you. If you have any questions, email us at agency or email Carrie at OCP. And yeah, we look forward to collaborating more and learning more in the future. So
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And a huge thanks to the agency team for really digging into all of this and for being flexible and adapting as we went. And hopefully this is useful. As I said earlier, we will officially launch, and I think Georg is gonna tweet this out as well, both the report and the mapping for sort of public review and comments. So please dig into it. We'd love to hear what you think about it and whether it's useful or not, and why it is and why not, and what's missing. So please don't hesitate. They're both, I shared the bit.lys, so thanks to Georg for setting those up, to both the report and the mapping. They're open for anyone to comment, so go forth and do so. Thanks everyone, have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
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 Bye.